Hello, this is the narrated PowerPoint presentation for the final exam of History of American Education by Nina Ellis Frischman. First off, I chose this particular image because it shows someone starting to ascend a hill or a mountain, reach the pinnacle or the apex, and then of course start to go down the other side. I thought this was appropriate because over the past 2 weeks, we've talked a lot about how the American educational system started off educating very few people, although ironically both girls and boys in New England in equal ratios. And then how the American system adapted due to immigration, due to changing circumstances, things like discussions on allowing women a greater access into the non-domestic sphere, the public sphere, how people of different racial identities, ethnic identities, particularly those who were descendants of African slaves, gaining access to the education system. So it's been a climb to get to the point to where we can have universal compulsory education. However, today we are still making that ascent, as though the quote-unquote access is available to everyone, we still see circumstances in which, based on socioeconomic status in particular, gender and race ethnicity, still have huge impediments to achievement for people in the educational system. So for the first question I decided to answer, I really wanted to look at the 5 founding ideologies we discussed on our first night of class and our first night together, and its impacts still on today's school. This first founding ideology is Protestantism. Back in the 19th century, particularly with Irish immigrants, there was this opposition to sending their children to public school because there was a decidedly anti-Catholic sentiment in the way that teachers interfaced and treated children who were Catholic, textbooks that were anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, and so on. But today, in today's secular society, we often forget that this is still a foundation for education. One great example is Max Weber's Protestant work ethic. This idea that if one works hard, one will be successful because God will bless you. This is a Calvinist idea that if you are one of the saved, if you are one of the elect, then God will bless you with prosperity. This undergirds everything in our educational system today. This idea that you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that you can work hard and get out of your circumstances, is kind of the foundation of universal education in this country. Unfortunately, it is a myth. It turns out that socioeconomic status still plays an impediment, an obstacle towards people being successful, and it has a negative. In the lower your SES, the lower your achievement, statistically speaking. So even though we have this myth about this Protestant work ethic, again, going back to the Calvinist Pilgrim idea, Puritan idea, that if you work hard, you can escape, we tend to blame, right, children who are not achieving well. We kind of put the blame back on the inner cities. We see this a lot with President Reagan and President Bush, George H.W. Bush, as well as George Bush. that we, instead of putting more resources into inner city schools, which have very high poverty rates and very high percentages of children of color, rather than encouraging to continue things like busing and this forced integration between people, parents who had taken part in white flight into the suburbs. Rather than to continue those programs, they criticized those programs. I'm thinking of President Reagan in particular, criticizing that and kind of putting the blame on the school systems themselves. So again, this, well, if you're not prosperous, if you're not achieving, then God isn't blessing you. That's very much a holdover from our Protestant ideology. The second is capitalism, that the entire discussion about school choice in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s was about this idea that in our capitalist society, that the more choice you have, it drives up competition, which drives up quality, right? So our schools, as public education, was seen as a monopoly with limited competition, that if we introduce competition into the educational system, that it will actually drive up quality. We saw this in the voucher system, the charter school system. We see this in homeschooling, right? That if you have a plethora of choice in the educational marketplace, that it will drive up quality and drive up achievement. Unfortunately, as we saw in Baltimore, privatizing parts of the public education system simply don't work. Even though there was a lot of media attention on providing this choice and having 9 schools in Baltimore under private education, a private educational company managing it, it was good for stakeholders, but there was limited evidence that it was actually improving achievement. The voucher system, very similar in places like Cleveland and Milwaukee. We have this voucher system, but it actually helps a very small percentage of students. I believe in Milwaukee it was less than 3% of students could actually were eligible for the voucher system. And what was happening was you had students who were already going to private schools. Now, rather than their families paying for it, they were able to exchange the voucher from the public school system. So it wasn't helping those children who had low SES backgrounds. Therefore, yes, achievement went up, but it was so small as to be insignificant. I thought it was interesting that in the year 2000-2001, there were just under 3,000 charter schools in the United States, but there were over 90,000 public schools. So even if charter schools fulfilled the promise of achieving higher academic standards and improving achievement, it helps such a small portion of American school children to be ineffective. The third founding ideology is republicanism. This is the idea that living in a democracy is the best form of government. We see this in history classes and political science classes and government classes, right? These are classes in which students learn about the history of our country, they learn about how our democracy works, and they are intended to help our students, right, become better citizens. By doing that, we are reinforcing this notion that republicanism and our democracy is the best form of government. Unfortunately, sexism and racism are still prevalent. As I mentioned in the Protestant and capitalism ideologies, we still see lower achievement for both girls when you're talking about STEM education after middle school, as well as children of color. This is at both the public and higher education. And these are holdovers from notions, and I would argue institutionalized systems that still reward children of affluent white families, still very masculine, that girls should have more quote unquote caring or feminized professions, teaching, nursing, caregiving, where boys should have more masculine careers, engineering, sciences, etc. Children in low SES backgrounds tend to have schools that are that have a high percentage of children of color, and achievement tends to be less. I believe it is less because of institutional racism, in which those schools still get less resources, less dedicated, not dedicated, but less educated teachers, and lower expectations. Those school districts that are turning around and tackling this achievement gap between children of color who come from lower SES backgrounds and white affluent students, those schools that are closing that gap are using project-based learning, they are using the arts, they are using collaboration to do that. And so it's a different kind of teaching that requires teachers who are much better educated so that they have more tools in their tool basket. And that's really, I think, the only way. But again, these founding ideologies put in place this idea that girls aren't as smart as boys, or, you know, I remember Derek Bok, the former president of Harvard University, making headlines because he said math is hard, right? And this was one reason why girls were not going into STEM. So it's this expectation of lower achievement. It goes the same way when we start talking about inner cities and urban cities and blaming the environment for low scores rather than looking at our culpability in producing or providing fewer resources. We're still talking about separate schools. They're still segregated schools, mainly because of white flight. White people left the inner cities when large migrations of people of color came. They left and went to the suburbs because they didn't want their children educated with children of color. The second question I want to tackle is a primary source analysis on the video and the documents on performance-based funding in higher education. This particular video clip aired on August 29th in the year 2014. Its context and origins kind of overlap. The problem that they were trying to tackle in Tennessee, this was about Tennessee colleges and the funding mechanism, was just over half, at 51%, of Tennessee college students graduated from college within 6 years. And so you had this situation where large amounts of students were going to Tennessee colleges, not graduating, and leaving with large student debt. So what Tennessee decided to do was to change its funding mechanism and funding formula for higher education. rather than paying schools based on their enrollment. They decided to pay schools based on the previous year's graduation rate. So 100% of state funding would be tied to graduation rates. On one hand, this sounds like a good idea. The more students you graduate, the more money you get, which would, of course, going back to capitalism, would increase choice, and students would probably elect to take their state funding to schools with higher graduation rates. But one of the biggest critics was Provost Bassett of the Southwest Tennessee Community College. This is in Memphis. She mentioned that Memphis was the poorest large city in the USA. So we're going back to that idea of lower SES. Community college, of course, are open enrollment. And she mentioned that the average ACT score for her students was a 16.5. So you're looking at a huge achievement gap and a large chasm taking students from where they are to where you need to be in order to graduate. And she argued that this disproportionately penalizes institutions like hers. However, one of its biggest proponents was President Hall from Austin Peace. He was the president of Austin Peace. And he actually talked about it as a good thing based on this concept of stickiness. That this is kind that the persistence of students was based on the kinds of experiences they get, not just inside the classroom, but outside the classroom, and that you had to encourage students to stick to the institution. One of the things that they do is they were actually successful in increasing graduation rates, partly because they increased the number and types of experiences that faculty, staff, and students could share outside the classroom. They used learning communities quite well. 35% of their students were grouped in a learning community where they took at least 3 classes together. He said this actually encouraged students to ask questions when they needed help of one another because they weren't strangers, that they actually had these classes together. And they also put in a system called Degree Compass. This is a software that predicts how a student would do in a class based on their previous educational experiences, educational coursework, as well as test scores. And he says this helps students and advisors plan coursework better. So if there was a course that you needed to graduate and you were predicted to struggle in that class, maybe you shouldn't take other classes in which you would struggle, but pair them with classes that you are predicted to do well in. And this also lets students know that if they were slated to struggle in a class, it would pair them with tutoring pretty early on, because they would know that they would need that in order to be successful. And this entire system was based on stars, just like something like Netflix or Amazon. So a class that got 4.5 stars would mean it would be more challenging than perhaps a class for 1 star. This was produced by PBS NewsHour and produced by Meryl Schwerin. The audience, because this is part of a news program produced on PBS, the audience really is Americans interested in things that are newsworthy, particularly in education. If this were a book or a magazine, we might say it was intended for the general reading public. So here it would be the general viewing public. The tone was quite conversational. They explained the background, the why Tennessee decided it needed to make this change, and then it interviewed um, the the president and provost that I referenced above. It was sponsored by PBS, and the language was, again, probably, I would argue, probably a ninth or 10th grade level. So, um, it was, again, because it was intended for the general viewing public, um, very conversational, and so it was really easy to kind of follow. Interestingly, the significance at the time, they mentioned that Tennessee was the first state to implement this kind of program, but 25 states actually followed suit, including Colorado. Colorado HB 14-1319 adopted a very similar funding mechanism for Colorado that would be fully implemented in fiscal year 2017. So at the time, this other states watched this very closely to see if it was successful. Today, particularly in Colorado, I think, based on the documents that you uploaded on HB 14-1319, for example, the students at CU Boulder, the Student Government Association, opposed this measure. Again, linking it to the potential that it could negatively impact certain kinds of students, particularly those from low SES backgrounds, and would negatively impact institutions that served those students. The Bell Center actually thought that this bill was going in the right direction, but again was equally concerned about institutions that served high percentages of low SES backgrounds as well as people of color. After looking at it, I think based on our founding ideologies, and the challenge with the achievement gap, I think this kind of bill is probably moving in the right direction, that you would reward institutions with higher graduation rates, thus looking at access, not just we let you through the door, but that we provide you with the resources you need to succeed is a good idea. But I do worry that places like the community colleges, which are open access, which charge lower tuition and have higher percentages of students from low SES backgrounds and higher percentages of students of color, that they will be negatively impacted disproportionately to some of the public institutions, four-year public institutions in the northern part of the state, which have higher percentages of affluent students and students, white students. And for my third question, I decided to look at the American educational system as a whole and come up with 5 recommendations for change based largely on our comparative education presentations from my peers as well as from you, Dr. Mendez. The first recommendation I would make is to create a national funding system for schools. So rather than funding being allocated at the state level or even at the local level, that there is a national system by which there is a standardized cost per pupil, and that those areas that are struggling to meet the achievement gap, to close that, would actually get more resources. This was a recommendation from your presentation on what high-performing countries do. Those countries that are succeeding educationally do have equity in their funding mechanisms. And while we are very large and have lots of school districts, I think by standardizing the amount we pay per pupil and then allocating additional resources for those areas that require it would go a long way towards creating an equitable system of education for all students. And I think this is what should occur at both the P12 and higher ed level. The second comes from Norway. And this Norway funds early childhood education fully at the age of 3 or 4. And that they include, again, there's this equitable funding mechanism. They are taught by highly qualified teachers with very professional credentials. In our country, kindergarten is not even, full day kindergarten is not even mandated, right? It's compulsory education after the age of 6. And yet those early years of education are so important for developing habits of mind, for having a kind of standard place where everyone comes from. I mean, if you have very limited access to books before the age of 6 and you have very limited access to educational tools, you're going to be in a very different starting place in first grade than a student who has had a preschool education from a and full day kindergarten with access to educational materials. So I think we should adopt Norway's early childhood education after 3. So that at 3 you go, let's say, 35 hours a week, which is the Norwegian model, and that it is funded by the government. So rather than funding it individually, which is why there's this disparity of attendance and access to early childhood education, that it's funded from taxes. I also think that those teachers should be highly qualified and well-trained. The third recommendation I have comes from Canada, and this is to use the testing data that we get from these large-scale assessments and use them as formative analyses rather than summative analyses. Right now, places like Colorado are testing every year from grades 3 to 9. I think we should reduce that because we are not seeing this increase in achievement from more testing. So I think we should have less frequent testing, perhaps on British Columbia, where they test in 4 grades. But then they use these analyses with the child and their parents to come with educational interventions, right? And we can do a longitudinal study of the student, right? So rather than just doing it and saying, you know, 3rd graders in Colorado are failing to meet the reading standard, say, you know what, X child is struggling in these 3 areas in reading. So as he or she goes to 4th grade, we're going to have additional resources to help that child overcome those challenges. Yes, we are, our educational system is on a magnitude 10 times larger than Canada, but this is why it becomes important to have resources standardized, normalized throughout the country, because those areas in which students are struggling, we should provide interventions. So these assessments should not just benefit or harm a school district, a state. It should benefit the student, him or herself, as well. 4, and this came from South Korea. It came from Venezuela. It came from Norway, Finland, and Canada, as well as your presentation on what high-performing countries do. Teachers should be trained well. As you mentioned, in Canada, only the top 30% of college graduates can go to a teaching college. So it is as in Norway and Finland, the Scandinavian countries, it is more competitive to get into a teaching college than to get into a medical school or law school. I think that it should be as competitive. Teachers are professionals, and the job market should be as competitive when they're going to be spending time with our children. And they should be paid as professionals competitive wages, right? So rather than paying teachers and adjuncts and beginning professors at the lowest end of the pay scale, they should be paid competitively with doctors, with lawyers, with professional athletes. So maybe professional athletes should be paid less. So teachers should be trained as professionals in a competitive environment, and they should be paid accordingly. And last, this came from your presentation on what the high-performing countries do, as well as those schools in the United States that are succeeding and are bridging the achievement gap, to adapt the curricula around critical thinking and collaboration. In schools that are using things like literature, right? I believe it was the Met School. Literature, a common literature in every grade level, and organizing the curricula around it, right? So what a third grader should know. In this case, I believe it was Asian, Near Eastern mythology, right? In places like the Harlem Zone, where there is a high degree of collaboration with students, in places where they are using the arts to teach the entire curricula, right? What all of these things, all of these methods have in common is that students have to take facts, they have to think about them critically and creatively, and they collaborate with one another to succeed. When you do that and you take the curricula and you embed it, right, in these critical, creative thinking, collaborative, project-based learning, students succeed. So while I am unconvinced that you have to have a single national curricula, I like the idea of a Common Core where these are the standards and you have a variety of ways in which you can meet that standard. However, it cannot occur with rote memorization. It cannot occur with just throwing technology at students. It has to come down fundamentally to teaching students to do something with that information. And we know that students learn best in a collaborative environment. So I think that that is the last recommendation for change I would make. These are my works cited pages. As you can see, I've got the presentations that I referenced as well as the videos that I referenced. Thank you very much for an excellent semester, and I will talk to you soon.